All right, just a couple of things to say about the concept of excellence. One of the things is you'll find that there are a few different definitions, and there's the obvious one, there's one I want to talk about in a little more detail nearer the end of this video, and then there's a slightly quirky one. And if you have an indulgent judge and you're feeling like doing something creative, there's a way you could take the topic in a slightly different direction. The first one, and the simplest one, is excellence means being above or better than others, being distinct. Being in a state of distinction, transcendence, and so forth, being superior to others. And that one's going to be the straightforward interpretation. Do you get the best possible results from cooperating or competing in whatever area it is that you're talking about? I'm going to hold off on talking about the second one because it's going to be one of the negative approaches that I want to save just for the time being. But the third one, excellence, is actually a title. And I don't mean a title of a book, I mean a title given to a person, kind of like your honor for judges, or at any rate, in governments around the world, one of them is the Governor General of Canada, the title that they are addressed by when they're carrying out the functions of their office is Excellence. And you can address formal letters to them, to His Excellence, Her Excellence. And so, if you get to where you want a slightly different approach, I think it would be kind of interesting to go into maybe a tournament or just a couple of rounds and be prepared to say what we are debating is whether cooperation or competition moves you up in a political career, whether you reach the highest levels of government to where people would address you as excellence as a result of cooperation or competition. In other words, is politics fundamentally a dirty business where you need to outcompete everybody? Or is all politics local? Is it a matter of doing favors for everybody and then calling in all the favors, which would be fundamentally cooperative? So, that's just something that you might file away and think about if you need to freshen up the topic, if it's getting to where too many of the debates are seeming identical to one another. It's not something that I would recommend doing for the entire season, but it has a little bit of potential. It could definitely be entertaining. So I have had, there's one more thing. One issue that you have to kind of work out, and I tied this to the definition of excellence, is who decides what is excellent? Is it the participants in the encounter, or is it an outside observer? One of the things that I think you're going to hear about a lot this year is a lot of different businesses competing in a marketplace. And it's a very strong assumption of business law in the United States that competition is important because competition yields so many benefits for the consumer. Now, if you think about it, the businesses involved that are competing against one another, they may not see the outcome of that as excellent at all. But the consumer, who has all kinds of choices, and presumably for the lowest possible price, because all the competitors can undercut one another, from the consumer's perspective, that is excellence. But is it excellence for the businesses that may be unable to make ends meet? And no matter how hard they try, they may not have any more improvement in them. So, in considering what excellence means, you need to ask yourself the question, from what perspective are we talking about excellence? Someone who is a party to the interaction, someone who is involved in the interaction, or someone who's outside the interaction, maybe receiving the benefits after everybody else has put in all their effort. So I have two ideas that I think have potential as negative approaches to the topic. And one of them, I think what you might want to consider doing, the first one, to say that your value is preservation of human life. And then the approach that you could take to the topic is the response in emergency situations. And I think you could say there is never competition in an emergency room. Whenever surgeons and nurses are involved in trying to save someone's life, it is the ultimate in cooperation. That's where a surgeon can just name the instrument that she or he wants, and the nurse will hand it over right there on the spot, and there's no contest at all. A second illustration in this line of response to an emergency and saving life when it's endangered would be law enforcement. Law enforcement is at its best when everybody involved in trying to either prevent a crime or track down a crime cooperate, and cooperate seamlessly. And I think you would find in the law enforcement literature that competition between law enforcement agents is actually very, very destructive. And a good illustration I think you could use of this is September 11th. Right around the time of September 11th, a lot of domestic law enforcement and domestic security agencies did not share information with each other. They didn't share the data they had, the intelligence that they had gathered, because fundamentally they were involved in a turf war. Now think about how it could have been different if they had cooperated fully, and if we had had enough information that enough key people saw the big picture and could have caught the September 11th terrorists before they carried out what it was that they were here to do. So that's an approach I think you could take. And I think it would be so very easy to defend if your value is preserving human life when it's in danger. What is your opponent going to say is a higher value than that? It's possible you could get into the affirmative says justice, the negative says life, and then it becomes, is life worth living in an unjust system? Well, does justice do you any good if you're dead? So possibly you could get into that kind of confrontation, but I think that's one that has a lot of potential. The other one, I have to admit, I'm just kind of entertained by this because I did not notice until today. There's a concept that comes a whole lot. It basically runs through all of classical Greek philosophy. There's a word, arete. And arete is most often translated as virtue. Shows up a lot in Homer, shows up a lot in Plato and in Aristotle, and it actually shows up in Philippians 4:8, and in the King James Version, it's translated as virtue. But in the New International Version, and this is an equally acceptable translation of it, arete translates as excellence. How's that for a good fit with the topic? Now, what both Plato and Aristotle, Plato speaking through Socrates in the dialogues, what they both agree is the source of virtue is knowledge. The substance of arete is knowledge. And in Socrates' case, it's knowledge about knowledge. Aristotle takes it just a little bit further to contemplation. And what I think you could do on the negative, I think if you dig in to what competition and cooperation do in education, I think probably you could say that in learning settings, when people are studying, when people are trying to improve themselves, that it's better that there be cooperation than competition. That cooperation is dominant. And the thing that I think is strategically useful here is you could tie that back to arete, and then you've got a really, really tight coupling between your side of the topic and a really nifty little translation of excellence. So that's something I think you ought to look into, possibly using education as your set of illustrations, and then saying excellence, the word excellence in the topic, means this is the best sort of area in which to judge competition versus cooperation, and that cooperation wins out. Very last thing I want to say before I bring this video to a close is there are a couple of resources that I think you might want to look into. One of them is for the affirmative side of the topic, for the competition side. Check out the Positive Coaching Alliance. And if you do a Google search for those 3 words, it pops right up. The Positive Coaching Alliance has been training coaches and parents in how to run youth games, youth sports leagues, in a way that maximizes the sort of transformative potential they have, the educational potential. And I think if you look through some of their materials, you'll probably find some good ideas that will help you talk about how competition is positive, and may help you beat back some of the ideas that will be in that Alfie Kohn book, where he says that competition is fundamentally destructive and everyone's just deluded about it having any benefits. The other thing, the thing that I think you might want to check out on the negative, this is an article that I just spotted today and was able to read the abstract. And probably you're going to have to go to a good university library to find this. But it's an article that appeared in a journal called Culture and Psychology, and it was in Volume 3, Number 2 in 1997. The pages were 137 to 141, and the article was by a scientist by the name of Hubert Hermans. And the article's title is Science Between Cooperation and Competition. And what he does is he makes kind of a developed, lengthy, enriched argument about, in the sciences, why cooperation has to be the dominant theme, why there are elements of competition, especially for grant funding and to be the first to publish, but that cooperation has to trump competition if science is going to work properly. And that's another thing, quite possibly, that you could tie back to the arete strategy that I was talking about a moment ago, because if Aristotle says it's contemplation, and if Socrates says it's knowledge about knowledge, then this Hermans article could close the loop, kind of complete the argument by saying, in the sciences, cooperation has to be dominant over competition. So, for now, that's what I want to leave you with, and in a few days I'll come back and I'll have a few other approaches to the topic, and quite possibly another round of things to think about as far as definitions. And I hope if you have gotten this far that you are starting to get excited about this topic, because I do think it's going to be a good one.